All right, when last we spoke, we talked about American involvement in World War II in Europe. And once we wrapped that up over there, once we helped the Allies win in Europe, then we realized that we also needed to um, come back. As it says here, it was time for the U.S. to defeat Japan and end the war finally. Okay? Now, on the same day that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, they also attacked American bases in Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. They invaded Thailand, Hong Kong, Malaya, now part of Malaysia, if you can see that here, and Burma, now called Myanmar, or yeah, I believe that's still correct. And Japan also took over Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Now, all of these were strategic sort of movements. Remember, Hawaii and these islands, not all of them, but some of them were midway points between Japan on the Asian coast and then between them and the western coast of the United States. So all of these were very strategic points, and specifically Hawaii, we had, a military presence there, which is why they chose Pearl Harbor. So all of this was an attempt to weaken U.S. defense and also U.S. offense and make it more difficult for us to stop them. All right, so here we have, if you'll see all of these red X's here, Hawaii that we talked about, but also Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines. They landed in China. Remember, they wanted their resources. Burma, Thailand, Malaya. Okay, so they're all over the land, the little islands. They're landing all over the islands between here and Hawaii. After months of conflict, American General Douglas MacArthur, his family, and some key aides were ordered to leave the Philippines to defend Australia. Okay, there was some concern that Australia would be a big target, so MacArthur was taken over here. The Philippines ended up surrendering to Japan at this point. The troops still in the Bataan province of the Philippines were captured and forced on a brutal walk of over 60 miles to the Bataan Peninsula prison camps, where hundreds of Americans and thousands of Filipinos were killed. The event came to be known as the Bataan Death March. So, you see the shape up here, that's the Philippine Islands. This is blown up here in a better sketch, and you can see where Bataan is. So then this peninsula here, they started in these two places here, and then they were ordered to come around all the way here to Camp, quote, O'Donnell, which is where hundreds of Americans and thousands of Filipinos here is, even though it's spelled differently, it's referring to the people who were native to and live in the Philippines. Okay, the Bataan Death March, because that's the peninsula they were on. 60 miles here, just to give you some context, depending on where you actually live, it would be similar to either walking from one end of Prattville to the opposite end of Montgomery and back, or making the loop from Prattville through Montgomery all the way north to Wetumpka and then driving all the way back through Millbrook to come back into Prattville. Okay, so 60 miles here, it's a long way. It is quite the distance, on top of which they were not in a car or any sort of vehicle. They were forced to walk, and again, they were captured, so they were not like given breaks or snacks or anything like that. So this was a very brutal thing that was happening in the Philippines when they surrendered to Japan. All right, Paige. All right. So now, after December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the Americans, when they retaliated, April 1942, the Americans launched air raids on Tokyo, which was not militarily significant, but did boost American morale. That means that it was not a huge win as far as the overall war effort was concerned, but it did make the American people feel like we were achieving something in the war. It kept spirits up, stuff like that. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, they blocked Japan from reaching Australia, helped by Admiral Chester Nimitz of the U.S. Pacific Fleet intercepting Japanese communications. Code cracking also helped the Allies prepare for the Battle of Midway on June 4th, 1942. In a major American victory and turning point, the American Navy destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. If you'll remember, they actually were not able to destroy any of our aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor in that particular attack. They were not in port. Whereas here at Midway, theirs were, where we could actually attack them and take down 4 of their aircraft carriers. Now, here are the code talkers that I referred to in a previous video. The U.S. used Navajo code talkers, Navajo soldiers who communicated in codes based on their tribal language. It was impossible for the Japanese or other outsiders to figure out the codes, and was an invaluable contribution to the war, because this was not a cipher, this was not a scramble, this was not some sort of code that someone came up with. This was using a language, a native language to these Navajo soldiers that the Japanese and other outside forces had no, they had no frame of reference for this language. They had no way of figuring out what they were saying. They had no way of translating. So it was very effective as a code for that very reason. It wasn't simply, okay, well, they used every third letter of something. No, it wasn't like that. There was no mathematical rhyme or reason to it. It wasn't based like that. It was based in a language that they had no access to. MacArthur and Nimitz adopted a strategy called island hopping to secure air bases in order to launch larger attacks on Japan. Capture small islands, use each as a base to capture other islands, okay? So if we have, several islands in a row right here, so we'd capture this one, we'd set up a base, and then we would just launch the small attack on the next one, and we'd capture it, and then we'd launch a small attack here, and then before we know it, we have 3 bases set up, and it's getting us closer and closer to our objective, right? And so we're hopping closer to the Philippines and Japan. That was the idea. It was time consuming, but effective, right? Setting up all of those bases, setting up all of those attacks, but it ended up working in their favor. From August 1942 to February 1943, the Marines fought to capture the island of Guadalcanal. In October 1944, let me underline these dates for you. Battle of Leyte Gulf, here, the Allies destroyed almost the entire Japanese Navy, and Allied forces liberated Manila in March 1945 and headed for Japan. Okay, this is a huge deal because the Japanese Navy, that was part of the reason why they were able to do as much as they were able to, was because they're an island nation. They had this very strong naval presence. But we were able to take the Navy out of the equation and liberate Manila and head straight for Japan. Using these island hopping techniques and working together with with the people from Australia using strategy and tactics and things like that. Okay, so look here at this map. This is what we're talking about here. Let me see if I can get it all kind of situated. Okay, so Philippine Islands and Leyte Gulf. Okay, this is where they're doing the hopping. Hop, hop. Looks like a 3. One more hop, hop. Okay, so this is where they're doing the island hopping. The Marines defending Guadalcanal, right here. The Battle of the Coral Sea, Battle of Midway. Okay, and all of this is in the Pacific Ocean, or what we came to refer to it as the Pacific Theater. And obviously that does not mean a place where you go to watch movies or a play. We're talking here about like an arena. Okay, this is how we're using that word. So let's talk about what happened once we started really making some moves on Japan. All right, and I think we'll go back to that map if I can get it to load again. We'll just see how well all of this cooperates. All right, reaching Japan. The Allied forces targeted 2 Japanese islands, Iwo Jima in February 1945 and Okinawa in April. Okay? In a desperate attempt to gain the upper hand, the Japanese used kamikazes, suicide pilots, to attack Allied ships, but the Allied forces still advanced. Here, what we're talking about is kamikaze. We're talking about soldiers who used their planes as bombs. So regardless of what weapons they had on the plane, if they had bombs, if they had guns, whatever, there would come a time when they would be expected to, if they were on a kamikaze mission, they would be expected to use their entire plane as a weapon, as a bomb, and they would pilot their plane into strategic targets and try and do damage that way. But this is sort of a desperate maneuver, obviously, because again, we talked about how men at this point, again, besides the sanctity of human life, men are a resource. You can build more planes, but it's harder to train more men, more pilots. So this was marking the beginning of desperation on Japan's part, that they were willing to sacrifice so many men so easily. Okay? And here, the A-bomb. Japan was unwilling to surrender, and the Allies considered a full-scale invasion. Okay? Now, what's the difference between the full-scale invasion tactics that we used over in Europe and the situation over in Japan? Well, Japan is an island nation. Okay? So we have different things that we have to take into account. So we thought about invasion, but we realized that we had also conducted the first successful test of an atomic bomb, or A-bomb, on July 16th, 1945. Okay? 3 years of work on the Manhattan Project, led by scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer. Here, if you'll see, FDR founded the Manhattan Project after Albert Einstein and other scientists had warned him that an atomic weapon was being developed by Germany. Okay, so this is another part of the arms race idea that we talked about. Einstein was German. There were other scientists that were brought over from Germany that shed light on this sort of situation of things being developed in Germany, and one of the things that they were warning us about was an atomic or radioactive sort of weapon, okay, here known as the A-bomb. Even though he knew that a single atomic bomb would cost thousands of civilian lives, President Truman saw it as a justifiable way to end the war and to save countless Americans. Truman issued the Potsdam Declaration. If Japan did not surrender, the U.S. would inflict prompt and utter destruction. Okay? So we're trying to back them into a corner. We know that they're getting desperate, but they're still unwilling to surrender, so we're trying to back them into a place where they'll be forced to surrender. So ultimately, since they do not surrender, we do decide to use the atomic bomb. We do decide to bomb Japan to force them into submission. Okay, because Japan did not really think that this was a serious threat. It sort of seemed just like any other type of threat. Japan did not surrender. So, on August 6th, 1945, the airplane Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. At least 75,000 people were killed in a single instant. Japan remained firm. Okay? They still said, okay, you've done it once, bet you won't do it again. Okay? They're still not going to surrender. So then, here we are, August 9th. The U.S. dropped another atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, killing over 20,000 civilians. And not to mention that, now we're almost at 100,000 dead immediately. Many of those who survived the bombings later died from radiation and horrific burns or lived with severe health problems and disabilities. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to this map here. So we've got Tokyo, that's the main city, it's where everything is happening. When we first, it's the center of all of these operations here. So when we first target Japan, we focus on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Okay? Then when we drop the first bomb, it's right here at Hiroshima. And then the second bomb here at Nagasaki is basically the reason why Japan ended up actually surrendering at this point. Okay, so we dropped the bomb on the 6th and the 9th, and then by August 15th, 1945, Japan surrendered. So then here, this was VJ Day, victory over Japan, whereas we had VE Day, previously victory in Europe. Okay, and some consider it August 14th because of the time differences between the U.S. and Asia, the international dateline and whatnot. But this is when this happened. Okay, and then on September 2nd, Japan signed the surrender documents, and World War II was finally, officially, totally, completely over. Okay. Now, let's talk about this last thing. What makes a nuclear weapon nuclear? Okay? The power comes from reactions in the nuclei. Remember, that's the plural of nucleus. We talked about this in chemistry earlier this year. Of atoms of radioactive elements, or elements that are actively shedding electrons. It says which emit energy, but remember, they're losing their electrons, actively losing their electrons. When the particles collide, the result is so strong that a tiny amount of material can create a huge explosion. Atomic bombs, or A-bombs, get their power by splitting the nucleus. Okay? So they have an atom in the bomb where it is actually split, and the power released when that nucleus is split is what powers the reaction in the A-bomb. And we also have, in the 1950s, I'm going to underline this specifically, because this was like the next version of it. This was, because, again, arms race, we always are looking for the biggest and best thing before another country has it. Even more powerful hydrogen bombs, or H bombs, were invented in the 1950s, and they're fusing multiple nuclei together, which can then be split apart. And so instead of splitting one nucleus, we now are splitting multiple nuclei, and you can only imagine how much more devastation that causes. All right, so here we have reached the end of World War II. If you'll notice, I have questions here. There are 8 of them. They should be dropping, I believe, in 2 groups of 4. So please go on Google Classroom and answer those for me. Let's see, I think I covered everything. So I hope you guys have a great and wonderful day.